it's a perfect place to make this announcement this morning. It's an important announcement. It's an announcement that many groups have been working toward. And a proposed development is being planned just over the hill right here. We've got Wilderness Battlefield right across the highway. We've got a number of groups that have been working on the preservation of Wilderness Battlefield here for many, many years. This same area was placed on the National Trust's 11 Most Endangered Places back in 2010. But we've got a fantastic coalition who's represented here today. We've got the Central Virginia Battlefield Trust, Cedar Mountain Battlefield Foundation, the Coalition to Protect America's National Parks, Friends of Wilderness Battlefield, Historic Germanna, the National Parks Conservation Association, the Piedmont Environmental Council, Preservation Virginia. We've been working very closely with our partners at the National Park Service through all of this, especially Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. And most importantly for the announcement today, the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Jim Lindberg is here to join us today. He's a Senior Policy Director at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. He has more than 30 years of experience in preservation, planning, and sustainable development. Jim has traveled from Colorado to join us today, so please join me in welcoming him to the stage to make the feature announcement.
Thank you, Bill. Good morning, everyone. Great to be with you here this morning. Again, I'm Jim Lindberg, Senior Policy Director at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. If you don't know about the National Trust, we were chartered in 1949. We're a national nonprofit organization that works to save America's historic sites, tell the full American story, build stronger communities, and invest in the future of historic preservation. And I'm here today joining you to announce that the Wilderness Battlefield area has been named to the National Trust 2024 list of America's 11 most endangered historic places. In the 37 years that the National Trust has worked with communities across the country to identify significant places under threat, we have seen this annual list serve as a galvanizing force for historic preservation, with more than 350 sites listed and only a handful lost. We have included the Wilderness Battlefield area on this year's endangered list due to the threat of that proposed large development that Bill mentioned. As proposed, the Wilderness Crossing development could include millions of square feet of data centers, distribution warehouses, commercial space, thousands of homes, and road construction on previously undeveloped land where soldiers fought and died. Wilderness Battlefield is one of the most intact historic battlefields in the region. Nearly 500,000 visitors come here annually for quiet reflection on a difficult chapter in American and Civil War history. That solemn experience could be impacted by visual intrusions, noise, and increased traffic if the proposed developments go forward. We hope that listing Wilderness Battlefield area as an endangered place will spotlight and uplift the advocacy work that has already been done by the broad coalition that is formed to preserve this historic place. And we stand with our preservation and conservation allies who are seeking to protect the Wilderness Battlefield area from development that could impair its potential to serve as a place for learning about our shared national history. Now, many of you know that this area has experienced development threats before. In 2010, the National Trust included Wilderness Battlefield on the 11 most endangered list when a big box store was proposed. And as a result, the Wilderness Battlefield Gateway Plan was created to guide new development, and the store was built elsewhere. We now join with advocates encouraging decision makers to remember and build upon these previous planning efforts, to listen to community concerns, and to avoid future negative impacts that could change this historic landscape forever. Now, this is one of 11 sites listed nationally, so if you're interested in learning about the other 10 sites, you can go to our website, savingplaces.org/11most, and I encourage you to do that and see what other places we are highlighting on this year's list. But again, the National Trust is pleased to include the Wilderness Battlefield area on this year's list and to support the efforts of Journey Through Hallowed Ground, the American Battlefield Trust, the Piedmont Environmental Council, the National Parks and Conservation Association, Preservation Virginia, and the other partners who have joined this coalition to save this important site in American history. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Lieutenant General Richard P. Mills. General Mills retired from a 40-year career in the U.S. Marine Corps in 2015. An infantryman, he commanded at all levels from platoon to force, including the historic 1st Marine Division. He served in Somalia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan. In June 2010, he assumed command of a newly created International Security Assistance Force Regional Command in Helmand Province, and as such was the first Marine Corps General Officer to command NATO forces in combat. He also served as a UN military observer in Palestine, on the staff of the U.S. 6th Fleet in Italy, and the U.S. European Command in Germany, plus as Commanding General, Marine Corps Combat Development Command in Quantico. His final assignment was as Commander, U.S. Marine Corps Forces Reserve. Upon retirement, he became President and CEO of the Marine Corps University Foundation, and today is representing the American Battlefield Trust Board.
Well, welcome, and thank you all for the opportunity to speak today. The whole audience, I usually get crowed out after I speak, not before, but I'll push on through this. Again, I'm speaking today as the trustee of the American Battlefield Trust. I see some hats out there with our emblem on it. Thank you for your support, and thank you for all of your support on historic preservation. You know, the Trust has saved over 58,000 acres nationwide of historic land threatened by development, land affiliated with battlefields here within the continental United States. Battlefields where U.S. citizens, men and women, gave their blood to build the wonderful country that we all so much enjoy today. So it's an honor for me to be here. It's an honor for me to speak. And let me remind you that many of those 58,000 acres that have been preserved by the Trust are right here in Virginia, many of them within Spotsylvania and Orange County. But the heart of the issue today is last April's rezoning of the 2,600 acres for the upcoming Wilderness Crossing development. This is by far the largest land development project ever made here in Orange County. As you can see from the maps around me on display, it will have a massive impact on historic resources here in the area and a massive impact on the gateway to the wilderness unit of the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. And it isn't just the size and the scope of this massive development that are problematic. The measure approving it it was unsatisfactory. It did not take into consideration the viewshed problems it will cause, the impact across the historic landscape of noise pollution from industrial areas. It didn't take into account the large number of people that will move to live into that development or the massive amount of water usage that will take place in order to support it. The build-out will happen over the next few decades. Ultimately, it could include over 5,000 residential homes. In a county, a rural county, that has only about 16,000 rural homes today, it will have a massive, massive impact. And it is the county, not the developer as usual, that will be hung with much of these costs. The developer is not going to provide water, sewage, emergency services, or schools for all these new residents. You will. They did not even offer, as usual with a development of this size, to build, say, a new elementary school to support all of these new residents. You will. But of biggest concern to us is the 732 acres within it that is deemed an economic opportunity zone. What does that mean? It means data centers. And there is no cap on how much square footage they can put within those 700 acres. Based on other experiences we've had, you're talking about up to 10 million square feet of data center. Think of the requirement of electricity. Think of the requirement of roads. Think of the requirement of water. It is huge, it is massive, it'll be on the local bills, not theirs. As some of the other speakers will expound upon as well, The data centers of this size have massive impacts on historical areas. Each building here, each building they are talking about building, will require the water and electricity support of a town of 25,000 people. Think about that for a moment. So, because of a host of substantive issues in the approval process and basic problems with infringing on the National Military Park, the American Battlefield Trust, along with partners such as the Central Virginia Battlefield Trust and Friends of the Wilderness Battlefield and local landowners, have filed a lawsuit against Orange County and the associated developers. We ask for your support. Now, we here at the Trust and the rest of the Battlefield Coalition welcome the National Trust's designation of the wilderness as one of the nation's 11 most endangered historic sites. We thank them for that. I will not say it's an honor, but it is warranted and it is necessary. We wish it didn't have to happen, but it has to happen. It has to be brought to people's attention, the threat that this development has become. You know, close by here, in the Wilderness Battlefield, General Ulysses S. Grant began the final overland campaign to end the Civil War. When he suffered horrendous casualties here, he was asked by General Lincoln, by President Lincoln, "What is your intent, sir? What is your intent? Are you going to withdraw and give up?" Grant said, "Not a chance. My intent is to fight it out on this line all summer until there is a resolution." Like Grant, we, the American Battlefield Trust and the Battlefield Coalition, intend to fight it out here until there is a successful conclusion. Again, I want to thank you for your support. I want to thank you for coming out today. I look forward to success in this project. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's wonderful to see such a wonderful, great turnout today. I'd like to give you a brief history of the wilderness. Just take a few minutes. Closer to the mic, guy. The wilderness is an area, when you see the capital W, you know you're talking about a man-made area, not the wilderness that we would think of with a small W. So this is an area that most historians agree it's about 70 square miles. It encompasses eastern Orange County, western Spotsylvania. It's bounded partially by the Rapidan and Rappahannock rivers, Mine Run on the far side. And if you can envision Spotsylvania Courthouse, draw a line straight across, and basically you've got the wilderness. That designation is because of the second growth timber that you see, very scrawny, very dense. So what happened to the original first growth timber? Well, you had a couple of events that occurred. Number one, it was all clear cut for tobacco farming originally in the colonial period. And then you had a series of iron mines that dotted the landscape from Fredericksburg all the way through toward Culpeper. Spotswood Furnace would be a good example. There's a highway marker. If you came in from 95 on 3, you would have seen that on your right-hand side. Catherine's Furnace, which is part of the National Park property, is another good example of one of those furnaces, and they burn tremendous amounts. You can imagine, you're talking 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. They burn tremendous amounts of wood. So this area ends up being pretty well clear-cut, and as I mentioned, the growth that comes in behind that is what's going to create this wilderness. Because the growth is so dense, you don't get a lot of sunlight. You're going to get all sorts of vines and briars and entanglements underneath. It makes transit in the area very difficult unless you happen to be in the vicinity where a road might cut through. And then try to add military operations to that scenario, and you can see the issue that you face. The last mention that I'll make as far as the deforestation is concerned is the planking of the road network, and that was done in order to help the farmers get their products but again, it contributed to that situation. Another feature of the wilderness that has been alluded to, and there's a great graphic up here if you get a chance to come up and view that later on, it's the presence of numerous abandoned gold mines in this area. We're talking, some of these gold mines are 300 feet deep. What we're faced with today is basically, these are now industrial waste sites which leach dangerous chemicals into the watershed and into the ground. And if you don't think that's an issue, keep in mind that the state has banned eating the fish out of parts of that watershed. I'd like to move on briefly to the Civil War. I think most of all of us are aware that we had three major battles within the Wilderness Complex: Chancellorsville, Mine Run, and then the Wilderness Campaign, which has been mentioned, kicked off the Overland Campaign. Tens of thousands of soldiers were killed and wounded in this area in these horrific battles, and it certainly marks this area as hallowed ground. Noted historian James McPherson cites specific instances at the 320 intersection where various Confederate soldiers in particular that were prisoners in an attempt to escape were shot down in that very ground. If this development is approved, goes forward as approved, there'll be an intense pressure on the existing road network for the folks who want to come here to pay homage to their ancestors. It's going to make visiting this area much more difficult. And if you want a vision, I love as you go back toward Fredericksburg. When you get to the Salem Church area, try to find Salem Church, and then envision 10 or 15 years down the road trying to find the wilderness battlefield in a very similar situation. Lastly, I just want to touch on the Walmart property that has been protected from the previous efforts back in the early 2000, around 2010. That when Walmart made that announcement, there was intense scrutiny from the preservation groups and noted historians. I've already mentioned James McPherson was involved in that. And after years of protest and, I might add, legal actions by this coalition, Walmart decided to move their site further down the road onto Route 3. So the original 50 acres Walmart donated back to the state, and that area is now protected for future generations. And I'm proud to say that the Friends of the Wilderness Battlefield stewards that property in an agreement with the Department of Historic Resources for the state of Virginia. We need to place similar restrictions and conditions on the wilderness crossing area to assure that future generations have protected areas to honor their loved ones who made the ultimate sacrifice on this ground. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Tom Van Winkle. He has served as the president of Central Virginia Battlefields Trust since 2016 and previously served 5 terms as president of the Friends of Wilderness Battlefield in Spotsylvania. Tom?
Thank you. I will try to talk loudly over our animal friends who seem to have a definite opinion behind me. Let's go back to July of 1863. The Union Army would have a victory by George Meade's Army of the Potomac, a little town north of us called Gettysburg. General Meade, however, would fail to aggressively pursue Lee's Army of Northern Virginia after that battle, and would draw the ire of President Lincoln, who thought he should have pursued him and finished Lee off. 1864 was an election year. Lincoln needed a commander who would finish Lee and would pursue him. He found that commander in General Ulysses S. Grant, who came freshly off his victory at the Siege of Vicksburg. So in March of 1864, Lincoln appointed Grant as commander of all the Union armies. Grant would decide to headquarter himself with George Gordon Meade's Army of the Potomac. After wintering around Culpeper Courthouse, after a last-ditch failed attempt at Mine Run to take Lee out, the Union Army would begin its new plan. Its plan was to cross the rivers and pass through this impenetrable wilderness battlefield, draw Lee out to open areas, and fight in a more preferable area. On the night of May 3rd and 4th, 1864, Meade would begin that plan. He would cross his left wing under General Hancock over where the Chancellorsville battle had taken place. Those soldiers would have to trample through the remains of human remains also of the previous battle. Meade's right wing would cross here at Germanna Ford and pass through the wilderness. Meade made a decision, however, to halt that right wing in the wilderness to allow his massive supply trains to catch up. That decision and other Union miscalculations caused the Union Army to have to fight exactly where they did not want to fight, right here in the thick, impenetrable wilderness. Lee, however, was granted what he wanted. He wanted to fight here in the wilderness because it would even out and nullify the Union Army's artillery and cavalry. So on the 5th and 6th of May, the fighting would begin here. No lines of battle could be formed here through the impenetrable wilderness. The forest would erupt in a blaze of fire from the musket firing. Men would fight and shoot at each other, and sometimes shoot at their comrades in error because they could not see each other. Wounded would lay helplessly in these fires. After the war, soldiers would comment on how they would hear the pop, pop, pop of the cartridge boxes going off on those wounded laying in the fire. After a successful counterattack and flank attack by James Longstreet, which would roll up the Union right, James Longstreet would be wounded by friendly fire nearly to the day a year later that General Jackson was wounded by friendly fire in the Battle of Chancellorsville. Finally, the fighting would end on the night of the 6th. Both armies would position themselves looking at each other. Neither one could claim a victory. So on the 7th, General Grant would make a fateful decision. He would make a decision that no Union general would make prior to him after a battle. On the late afternoon of the 7th, Grant would tell Meade, make all preparations to march to Spotsylvania Courthouse. In other words, there would be no retreat. Grant would fight Lee from this point on and make Lee his point, would make Lee his target, and relentlessly fight Lee's army until Lee could fight no longer. This was the beginning of Grant's overland campaign. This was the first phase of the beginning of the end of the Civil War. This wilderness battlefield would see over 29,000 casualties combined, 17,000 on the Union side, 13,000 Confederates. Now, we at the Central Virginia Battlefield Trust were formed in 1996 to preserve battlefields at Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and now Mine Run. We have saved nearly 2,000 acres in these battlefields to date. 300 of them were here at the Wilderness. As you look around us, some of that property is the adjoining property we can look at today. Those who have fought and fallen here on the ground we stand on today would have anticipated their sacrifice and their suffering to be recognized, honored, and respected. The best way to do this is to save the very ground that they consecrated. The approved rezoning of more than 2,600 acres, allowing more than 5,000 residential units, 200 square feet of mixed commercial use, 732 acres of data centers and distribution warehouses, will forever impact this historically sensitive area. A project of this magnitude is unprecedented in this area. The Central Virginia Battlefield Trust agrees with our partners that the development plan fails to analyze serious impacts to the historic landscape and public utilities or to address major environmental repercussions. Moreover, repeated procedural errors and failure to comply with the Virginia Code, the county's own comprehensive plan, compel us as neighboring landowners to challenge the decision with our coalition partners at the American Battlefield Trust, Friends of Wilderness Battlefield, and other impacted landowners. Let's be clear, we are not opposed to growth. We are opposed to rampant growth with no consideration to the historical and cultural resources placed upon our stewardship by those Americans who fought and fell here. We seek and will always seek a win-win solution. The designation given here today of the wilderness on the top 11 endangered battlefields serves as notice of the fragility of our history and the need for us to preserve it. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Elizabeth Kostelny. She served as CEO of Preservation Virginia for over 20 years. Preservation Virginia is the nation's first statewide nonprofit historic preservation organization. All of the members of the coalition have worked with Elizabeth and Preservation Virginia, both individually and collectively, and we have greatly appreciated her leadership. So, Elizabeth?
Thank you. And good morning to all of you all. During our 135-year history, Preservation Virginia has helped save more than 400 historic places. We accomplish this work by partnering with individuals, local, state, and regional and national organizations and localities. We support communities by sharing expertise, and we raise awareness of solutions that ensure historic places are valued. One important way to raise that awareness are most endangered listings. Unfortunately, as you've heard, this isn't the first time Wilderness Battlefield finds itself either on the national or the state most endangered list. Preservation Virginia supported the Wilderness Battlefield Coalition and others by including it on the state list because of the controversial Walmart project that you've heard about this morning. Flash forward to 2022. Virginia's most endangered historic places sounded the alarm about the explosion of data center development that are impacting historic battlefields and historic sites around the Commonwealth. Manassas National Battlefield Park, Culpeper National Cemetery, Brandy Station, and here at Wilderness. They join a growing Virginia list of historic sites threatened by data center development. The National Trust's inclusion of Wilderness Battlefield to America's 11 Most brings national attention to the scope and scale of this growing challenge. Generations of Americans have felt the powerful connection to history that plays out over these landscapes. They've prioritized preserving these places and the viewsheds, including Germanna, Salubria, Brandy Station Battlefield, Madden's Tavern, and the U.S. Colored Troop Memorial at Ebenezer Baptist Church, to name a few. America's 11 Most has included Virginia sites in the past, and those listings have leveraged action. Rassawick, Shockoe Bottom, the James River, Pine Grove Rosenwald School, and Jamestown all have gained increased visibility for solutions for their inclusion on America's 11 Most Endangered Historic Places. Today's announcement should be a rallying cry, not just for the groups gathered or for you all here today, but for local and state decision makers, industry experts, and others to resolve these threats and protect these vital historic and cultural places. I want to thank the National Trust for Historic Preservation for including wilderness on this year's list. I want to thank all the coalition members who have been working tirelessly on this issue, and I want to thank all of you for showing your concern today. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Our next speaker is Chris Miller. Chris has served as the president of the Piedmont Environmental Council since 1996. He also serves as a board member of the Journey Through Hallowed Ground. He's a national leader in environmental and conservation and preservation issues, and it's a great honor to have Chris join us today. So, Chris.
Good morning. What a great place to be. Aren't we lucky to have agritourism on display? And what a better choice than what's being proposed next door. Piedmont Environmental Council was created in 1972 by folks who lived in this region. We work in 9 counties from Loudoun and Clark in the north down to Albemarle along the east side of the Blue Ridge. And we work with communities on building a sustainable future by protecting and restoring the lands and waters and working to build sustainable communities. What does that mean? That means being involved in issues like this. It means working on long-term alternatives in conservation and preservation, and working to sustain public involvement so that we can respond when we are threatened. I want to thank the National Trust for Historic Preservation for the recognition of the importance of the combined efforts of the Wilderness Coalition and all those concerned by the threat represented by the proposed wilderness crossing. The National Trust continues to raise awareness of critical issues in important places in the United States. We all value their many contributions in the cause of preservation. I also want to thank each of the organizations in the Wilderness Battlefield Coalition. Over many years, we've worked together to highlight the importance of this stretch as one of the oldest highway routes in America. We continue to benefit from your dedicated efforts to conserve, to engage, to educate, and to empower local communities in the broader world. And we are honored to be partners with you. The threat of wilderness crossing ripples region-wide and across Virginia, and now across the nation. It's likely to draw the largest increase in electrical generation in our history, doubling and tripling the size of the infrastructure that's built across our landscapes. The threat to the Piedmont, the threat to the wilderness battlefield area, epitomizes the threats to historic, scenic, and cultural resources that result from the proliferation of data centers and their associated energy infrastructure. Just think of this proposed footprint of wilderness crossing and what it does for the whole Route 3 corridor. It threatens a historic connection between Fredericksburg and the agricultural production in the Rappahannock Basin and even west from the Shenandoah Valley. Places like Germanna and Spotswood Palace, Salubria, Brandy Station Battlefield, Madden's Tavern, the U.S. Colored Troop Memorial that was just put in place 2 years ago, and now the 40,000-acre Rapidan River Clark Mountain Rural Historic District that's proposed and will be made public in the coming months. Each of these places, just along Route 3, tell an important part of American history. They are a part of an intact landscape, and it's very, very much at risk. Far from providing a gateway to the area, the wilderness crossing proposal extends the thoughtless sprawl development along Route 3 that has already surrounded Salem Church Battlefield, encroaches on Chancellorsville. Combined with the decision to approve data center complex adjacent to the Culpeper National Cemetery and an Amazon data center near the newly designated Brandy Station Battlefield Park in Stevensburg, the potential impacts of data center construction represents a huge step backward, a rapid move to industrialize rather than preserve the historic character of this area. You've heard about what a typical data center will bring. There's no such thing as a typical data center anymore. The engineering and the future design of these buildings is changing on a month-to-month basis. What used to be 100,000 square feet and maybe 30 megawatts of power demand is now 1 million square feet and approaching a gigawatt per data center. Well, what's a gigawatt? You know about North Anna Nuclear Power Plant down the road? That's the baseload supply for Virginia. There are 2 of them in the state. And it's 1.8 gigawatts if all its generation capacity is being utilized. So imagine 10 million square feet of data centers just over here. It will bring additional transmission lines and, by necessity, additional generation on the scale of 1 or more nuclear power plants. If you did it as renewable energy, which is an admirable goal, it's in the tens of thousands of acres of solar, plus batteries. It's natural gas, it's several large natural gas generation plants. So that's the scale that this single decision that this local government took in secret without revealing any of the data or even who the proposed developer was going to be. And that's why the coalition has taken the step of challenging it through litigation and asking for a reconsideration of those decisions. I hope you'll stick around and talk about, what the risks of all of these things are, but you don't have to leave it to your imagination. We know what a 500 kV transmission line looks like. Imagine 1 or 2 more just to serve this site. We can go look at a nuclear power plant. We know how big they are. That is what power would be necessary to serve this site if it's built out to scale. There is an alternative. The National Trust asked us to talk about what the future might hold. We did actually have a plan that was worked out by the coalition in the county called the Wilderness Battlefield Gateway Study. We did community engagement, we did planning, all of which has been ignored in this rezoning. I think the partners remain committed to a future that makes conservation and preservation of the unique resources along this corridor a priority. Just this past weekend, we celebrated with Historic Germanna the dedication of 170 acres of forested land in conservation easement at Seagan Forest at Germanna Ford along the Rapidan River. It comes with a new boat launch, so people have public access to the river and can enjoy the beauty of that forested landscape. It'll help with our tourism, our agritourism, our heritage tourism, and our ecotourism. This past month, important farms in Orange and Madison were placed in agricultural land easements, further extending the area of conservation up the Rapidan watershed. We know how to do something better. All of us are committed to that future. We call on Amazon and all involved in wilderness crossing to acknowledge the impacts of the proposed development that threaten these efforts and must be reconsidered. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Our next speaker is Kyle Hart, who is the program manager for the Mid-Atlantic region of the National Parks Conservation Association. All of the members of our coalition are part of weekly calls with Kyle. He's provided a great deal of leadership, not just here in Orange, but in Prince William County, Fauquier, Loudoun, Culpeper, and the list goes on. So our next speaker is Kyle Hart.
The problem with being short is you often have to move the microphone. And I actually happen to be the last speaker today, and I dread doing that as well, because I have to follow all of these excellent speakers like General Mills and Chris Miller and Bob and Tom and everybody else. First and foremost, thank you all for being here. I mean, genuinely, what a turnout for this announcement. As Bill said, my name is Kyle Hart, and I work for a nonprofit organization called the National Parks Conservation Association, or NPCA. We are a nationwide nonprofit dedicated to protecting and enhancing America's national parks. for present and future generations. People always say, and we always say, that national parks are the forever business. The idea is that these places that are special for a variety of reasons, be it Yellowstone for its wildlife and geology, or Civil War sites here in Virginia like Wilderness or Manassas, they all serve a very important and special part of American history. NPCA is proud to have more than 1.6 million members and supporters nationwide. I'm sure that counts many of you here today. We have 44,000 members in Virginia, and we are genuinely honored to stand here today with the Wilderness Battlefield Coalition and the National Trust for Historic Preservation to recognize the threat to Wilderness Battlefield and obviously sort of the broader Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Battlefield Park. As national park advocates, we are deeply concerned that Wilderness Battlefield has, as you've heard, once again been named as one of America's 11 most endangered sites. Of course, this battlefield and this historic landscape was threatened in the past from a proposed Walmart supercenter, and our coalition rejoiced in 2011 when Walmart agreed to move their site up the road and then donate that land, as was mentioned earlier today, to historic preservation and public access. We then underwent, as Chris laid out, as a coalition, a comprehensive planning process with numerous stakeholders, landowners, decision makers, to create a path forward that would allow for economic development and historic preservation in the county and the region. Unfortunately, today we are faced with a threat in a massive redevelopment project here and a threat region-wide that throws more than a decade, arguably decades worth of conservation work out the window. The threats faced by Wilderness Battlefield are emblematic of a crisis unfolding across Virginia in the Mid-Atlantic region. I have said, and we'll continue to say, that the explosion of an unregulated and unchecked data center development industry in the state of Virginia and across the Mid-Atlantic region poses the biggest threat to historic sites and national parks that the region has ever seen. Decades of smart growth, historic preservation, land conservation are all being thrown out the window to make room for this one industry in particular, data centers. This has come at the peril of dozens of nationally significant battlefields, historic sites, national and state parks, state forest, and historic rural communities across the region. Manassas National Battlefield, Prince William Forest Park, Culpeper National Cemetery, Richmond National Battlefield. The list goes on and on. All threatened by irresponsible data center development in Virginia and Maryland. Now in Maryland, as I said, this is a region-wide problem. In Maryland, we see sites near the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, the Monocacy Battlefield. Countless more parks and historic sites are threatened, as Chris laid out, from the explosion of additional electrical infrastructure needed to power this industry, and the air and climate pollution that will be driven from dirty fuel sources like coal and natural gas, and the diesel generators that the industry relies on to power their massive systems. Now, I'd like to point out that I think most of the groups on this stage would agree that we are not opposed to development. We are not opposed to data centers. I think it was Tom who kind of pointed out what we are opposed to is bad projects, projects that don't take into consideration historic impacts, traffic, communities, that don't consider the impacts to their energy use and water use. Historically, though, in the state of Virginia, the data center industry has failed to play by the same rules that we expect out of everybody else, and that is time to change. We now stand to say that the data center industry must play by those same rules and live within the same guidelines that we have expected out of industries like Walmart and others for decades. The tremendous scope and region-wide nature of this threat led to the formation of the Virginia Data Center Reform Coalition in late 2023, of which NPCA is proud to co-lead with PEC and others on this stage. That coalition has, it says 20 on my page, but I think we're probably pushing 30 nonprofit organizations, homeowners groups, and communities all over the state. And we have called on local, state, and federal officials to implement common sense regulation for the data center industry. Regulations that would prevent projects like Wilderness Battle or like the Wilderness project from going forward. The coalition's desired changes include better planning for siting of data centers to protect our historic sites like Wilderness Battlefield, transparency about the industry's energy demands, water use, and cumulative impacts on electricity use. Industry-wide efficiency and sustainability standards, policies that require local governments to consider regional impacts, something that Orange County failed to do, and the shift of infrastructure cost away from the industry itself and onto ratepayers. Today's announcement from the National Trust and our partners should be an immediate call for action from local and state legislators to seriously regulate the data center industry in Virginia and beyond. Without comprehensive action from our elected leaders, countless historic sites and national parks may continue to fall victim to this unchecked and unregulated data center growth, and we are proud to stand alongside our partners to bring that change forward. Today's announcement is one small step, but an important step in bringing this about, and we thank you all for being here and for your time.
Thank you, Kyle. You know, as I stayed in Fredericksburg last night and just driving in this morning, and you see where development stops and the open space begins. And as we turn into Wilderness Run Winery here, and you see the use of this property. You know, this General Meade's headquarters was just over the hill. The area where you're sitting was an Army encampment. This is a sympathetic use as you're driving into the national park. You know, and we'd like to thank our friends at Wilderness Run for hosting us here this morning. 500,000 people come to Wilderness National Park every year. And this is that kind of sympathetic use that we're looking for, that preserves open space. It has the right message. Wilderness Run, 1781 brewery. It's a great place for visitors as they're coming in. A giant data center is not what we need right here. And as some of the other speakers have said, we're not against data centers. We need them. We can't have our tablets and our phones and our computers without them. We just need a sensitive placement of these data centers throughout the region. And it's such a great honor to be named to the National Trust's 11 Most Endangered Places. I'd like to thank Jim Lindberg for being here to help make the announcement.
Hello, this is Trace Atkins. To stay up to date on all the latest and coolest videos, please subscribe to the Trust's YouTube channel. Preserve, educate, inspire.